I recently tried out the demo for Lone Fungus 2. By all account, it looks like it's going to be a nice game. But there was one thing that stuck out to me, and that was the ways in which Lone Fungus 1 is different from Lone Fungus 2. Now you might immediately notice that the resolution differs, but I'm thinking about a different thing. If you look at all the environments in Lone Fungus 1, they're fairly empty, actually by all accounts kind of boring. And I don't mean that the biomes are poorly drawn, but rather that each room is quite bland, and you often can't really tell rooms apart. But when I played the demo for Lone Fungus 2, we get some more flowers and set design. We also get some of those extra details, like windows. Basically, Lone Fungus 2 overall seems like it's going to be an improvement from Lone Fungus 1. It's more polished, but by and large, many things are actually quite the same. Now it's obvious that if you're going to make a sequel, many things ought to stay the same. But I think by looking at the developer's first game, and then seeing what changes they make as they get better, we can to some extent see what the developer finds important. So I want to talk about it. When developing our game, we don't have an infinite amount of time. So what should we focus on? Well, our first goal is to make the player stick around playing our game for as long as possible. So first and foremost, they probably need to understand the controls or mechanics of our game. Second, we need the mechanics or controls to be enjoyable to handle. If the controls aren't fun to use, the person playing the game isn't going to find the game enjoyable to play. Now we probably want a gameplay loop of some sorts, something that can give the player an aim or a direction. Once we have these things, we might worry about the pacing in the initial stages of our game. Maybe we want to add some slight differences in how you might be able to play, so maybe with a sword or a shotgun, so you may maybe add some few abilities, or some secondary gameplay loops. And then once we have this, then we perhaps worry about the pacing in the later stages of our game, and at this last stage we might start to care about the end game and achievements. And I would probably argue that it's next to impossible to get a fun game without these three. But you could have a game that kind of works even with poor pacing. This list isn't gospel by any means, I'm not a game designer, and different developers might prioritize things differently from me. But I think we can all agree that the small things that you end up doing, like fighting and climbing, needs to be fun in order for the game to be fun. Having lots of weapons doesn't matter if the combat isn't fun to use. You can have a fun game with a terrible story, but if you have terrible gameplay, your story doesn't matter. When we make our game, we need to have a minimum viable product in mind. So Lone Fungus 2 seems like it's going to be a more fleshed out game than Lone Fungus 1, but it's still built on top of a solid foundation, the simpler Lone Fungus 1. The same goes for Ori Will of the Wisp. It's significantly more complex than Ori and the Blind Forest, more weapons, more upgrades, more types of combat, but it's built on the same foundation, the basic game of Ori and the Blind Forest, which was already fun. But why this idea of a minimum viable product is often talked about in terms of gameplay and game design, I feel like it's rarely talked about in terms of game art. But I think we have a somewhat similar principle going on. So if gameplay and mechanics is the most important thing to get right as a game designer, what should we make sure to get right when we're making the art for our game? Well, the things that impact gameplay. To me, this often means that the most important art-related things to get right is character animations, followed by gameplay communication. I sometimes see games that have quite elaborate backgrounds, but the character looks horrible to control and is barely animated. If I get annoyed by controlling the character, I won't play your game, so the elaborate backgrounds don't matter. A similar thing can happen with how the art communicates our gameplay. If the UI doesn't make sense, the player won't enjoy playing the game. If the assets don't communicate what's going on, like if the enemies don't have any anticipation in their attacks, the game is going to feel unfair to play, which might consequently make the player not want to play your game. But okay, what comes next? Well, I mentioned something like the importance of world building, and how it seems as if Lone Fungus 2 has better world building than Lone Fungus 1. Does that mean that it's important? Well, probably not, because Lone Fungus 1 was already a good game. But it's next to impossible. Actually, there aren't many games that I can think of that have inconsistent styles. Almost every single game you play, no matter how bad the art is, still is consistent in their style. We can go back to looking at Matty Thompson's first games, like Jumper, or An Untitled Story. Bad art, but consistent. The style was distinct. It was well defined. Later games like Celeste looks polished and nicer, but the original games of Jumper and An Untitled Story still had a well-defined and clear style. This is why I often talk about how it's not that important that the art looks good. Because we have lots of fun games that people enjoy to play that don't actually look that good. But once we have this, then we can start to look at making our style and our assets evoke some type of emotion, or evoke a mood, or fit the theme of our game. So we can actually look at Rogue Legacy 1 and compare it to Rogue Legacy 2. Because I would say that a lot of the assets are still kind of the same, but we can see one big difference when we play the game. The UI and a lot of the smaller details, like when you die, just fit the overall game better in Rogue Legacy 2. In Rogue Legacy 1, it still looks as if it stylistically matches the rest of the art style and the rest of the game, but it doesn't feel as immersive. Once you've checked these three, then I think we need to worry about kind of making our game look good. It's important to note here that looking good could mean many things. So it could be that your game art looks unique. It could be that your game art looks realistic. It could even be that your game art looks ugly, so much so that it's funny, so much so that people like it. But it should have some type of appeal. And for this, it doesn't really matter which game we look at. For every game that does get a sequel, the original game usually has focused quite a bit on these things. And so when we see the sequels, these things actually don't change that much between the original game and the sequel. The style and the appeal is already there in the original game. What does change our sixth thing, and that is world building or set design, which we can see if we look at a game like SteamWorld Dig. It still looks nice. The style is still there. The appeal is still there. It's very consistent in what it's going for, and if we compare it to SteamWorld Dig 2, all of those things are basically the same. What does differ between SteamWorld Dig 1 and SteamWorld Dig 2 is that we just have more of it. More set design, more world building. The environment looks richer. And this is kind of my point. Some people, they start trying to make their game rich without having done these previous steps. But you shouldn't make things rich if you don't actually have a decent core to build on top of. And this doesn't just go for SteamWorld Dig, but if we look at Guacamelee, it's the same thing. The environments in Guacamelee 1, fairly empty. And it's not until we get to Guacamelee 2 that we have more set design, more world building, more flowers. And on that note of Guacamelee 2, we can look at effects and particles and lighting. Guacamelee 2 uses more normal maps and has more lighting effects. But at the same time, it wasn't necessary. Guacamelee 1 was still a nice game, a game that people played. It's not until this stage that we should really care about making these funny skins or funny hats. Like in the demo here, where a pixel animated character looks basically 3D. It's nice, but technically not necessary. And it makes sense that this is something that is more focused on, not in the original game, but in its sequel. Because it's not until this point that your style is so well defined, your appeal is so well defined, and so you basically have more time to spend on these small, in the grand scheme, insignificant things, but that does elevate your game. But I think at times there's a risk to try and stuff as many things as possible in our scene. To make this asset, and to make these quirky little details like this brick here look like a mushroom. Which, yeah, sure, it's nice. And I like that it's there. But you can have a good game without it. Which is also kind of why I made my video on why showing the sky is a mistake. It technically isn't. It's just that choice alone will force you to focus on world building and set design. But if you're sitting with a game where you don't have these 4 things covered, and you're struggling with these 4 things, I don't personally feel as if you should focus on these other things that much. They're not necessarily a waste of time, but they're not gonna sell your game. Stylistic consistency and making your game appealing will help sell your game, and gameplay communication will make the players stick around to play it. So I want us to look at a game that was uploaded to the Nonsensical 2D subreddit. It's called Stunt Boost. It's made by a small studio, but we can see it looks awesome. I think it looks great. The style is consistent. It really matches that appeal part in that we have these kind of nice harsh outlines. We have these flat clean colors, but it really matches this children's room vibe. And we can also see that even when the world building is done, like when they make trees, they have these sort of goofy ideas of how to make it, which makes the game feel cuter. And we can see here on the UI, both has this kind of racing aesthetic, but it also matches the game aesthetic. And so when we see all of these things and look through this hierarchy of things I find important and which things I care about the most, this game looks like a game that would be sold. And it looks like a game that people would pay to play. So what should a game like this care about when it does so many things well? And this is where it gets kind of tricky because I haven't played the game. But because of how much a speedrunning games relies on effects to sort of add that juice, and how much a racing game relies on not just readability, but signaling and visual communication where you can see where to go in a split second. Before you have to make the choice of where to go, the game has already signaled to you the upcoming route. But you might run into problems where the player gets annoyed at a small junction in your game. A small section of the map, they crash because that section isn't readable and doesn't communicate clearly where to go next. And in a game like this, you're going to have a lot of different maps. Where I would personally focus my energy, without having played the game, is to do a lot of user testing. Which sucks if you don't have a budget. But it's important to get that minute feedback of, is this map fun to play? Does my character feel as if it's going fast enough? Because if you don't have those aspects in a racing game or a speedrunning game, you probably don't have a fun game. Your game looks good enough to sell, but is it good enough for the people to stick around? Personally, this matches really well with what I like. And I actually like the color scheme. I think that it works well in a sort of children's room to have that mix of kind of cartoon aesthetics with a realistic lighting. And so you might notice something when you watch my videos, is that I repeat these things quite often. And that's kind of because if you don't have these two things, I don't think you really have a game. With all of this said, this game is called Stunt Boost, and Lone Fungus 2 is on Kickstarter for another 3 days. Sadly, it doesn't look as if it's going to reach its goal, but I do wish to play it when it comes out. Thanks for watching. Bye.